I think we wait another minute or two. I think that's rather, some are in with us through YouTube, through the YouTube channel. So if you don't see many, you don't know how many are somewhere behind, just because that's the other way around. Also because not everyone maybe has registered timely. And so that is then the alternative. But it is really good to see you. I think I did not have even the chance to congratulate to you. So it is really good to have you in the club of those who have not just survived, but entered into this new club. And I think that this will be a fascinating topic for all of us to listen to. And if I may just make it short by asking you to give us a little introduction also to your relation to Romania. Mm-hmm. And then if you then could continue with your presentation about your dissertation.
Okay, thank you. My name is Pam LaBreche, and I was a mission.
There's a little technical problem. We hope
expected when we went. And so we never did exactly what we thought we were going to do, but we did other things that God determined were better. So we worked in the context of the Areopagus Center for Christian Education and Contemporary Culture in Timișoara for our whole ministry, but we did other things alongside that, some teaching in Bible institutes, some mission administration and helping other missionaries, and a variety of things. So my main job was librarian for the Areopagus Center, and actually I'm still doing that, some of that by distance, which for me is just a joy. Instead of my job, now it's my hobby. So for me, that's fun. But I did finish my dissertation and defended it in 2019. And that was after we had moved back to the States. We did that for a number of reasons, one of which was my husband's health. And we're now serving at the Center for Intercultural Training in North Carolina. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a moment. What I wanted to do today, to talk about something that was practical and also that's related to what I'm doing now, was to give you a comparison of a couple of projects. One, my dissertation, and the other, the research project that I am finishing up now, and talk about sampling and access and how those have actually contributed to the results of the project. One which was, fortunate, and one not so much. So do feel free as I'm going through to ask me some questions if you'd like. And I'm going to try to share my screen here. I just have a little PowerPoint to remind me of my talking points and also to help you follow along. Could somebody enable screen sharing?
Is it not on your screen?
It says it's disabled.
Okay, I'll put you on. Does it pop up now?
No, it should work. That's a cost.
Let's try. Okay, yes, thank you. Let me find the right one. There we go. Okay. Okay, so I'd like to talk about sampling and access issues and compare the projects that I've been working on. One was my dissertation, which had as the title, Locals as Stakeholders, an investigation of the contribution of Romanian Evangelicals to North American Missionary Ministry evaluation. And I'll explain what the goals of that research was. And then what I am just now finishing up in terms of writing the report is an impact evaluation of pre-field missionary preparation for the Center for Intercultural Training, which is where I'm now based and where I'm working. And I'd like to focus on sampling and access issues and how those relate to doing some research. My dissertation, I just told you I worked in Timișoara for 22 years, basically in the Areopagus Center for Christian Education and Contemporary Culture. Andy, my husband, and I were founding members of the center, which aimed to be a platform for ministry within the academic community and helping Romanian Christians have an impact on society and on various domains of professional life. So while we went to be involved in theological education, we didn't do as much of that, but we found that the Areopagus Center had a very broad reach in terms of helping Christians from various confessions, and not just from Timișoara, but from around Romania, find their voice in society and take academic life seriously and relate their Christian faith to that. It was also a platform that allowed me to get to know a lot of people. Areopagus as a ministry to missionaries and also a way to help fund the budget, provided Romanian courses for missionaries. And so in my role at the center, I did get to meet a lot of missionaries that came through for that, as well as those that collaborated on various kinds of outreach ministries or educational activities. While I was in Timișoara, there were changes in our home church in the United States, and eventually we decided to go ahead and join the church in Timișoara. So we were members of a Baptist church in Timișoara, which also gave us a different kind of relationship with local people, because they saw us not just as missionaries from the outside who are maintaining our independence, but who also were integrated into a local church and had accountability within that local church. Over the years, both Andy and I took on different kinds of leadership roles within our mission. I became the language consultant for second language acquisition. My husband became training director and field leader and training director for Europe-wide for our mission. And eventually we were asked to become the coordinators for the department overseeing missionary development in its different forms within our mission. That role didn't last as long as we would have liked, but that was the role that I was in when I started my PhD. And so it was very natural for me to start thinking about what will help us, what kind of research would help missionaries in their development and would help organizations as they're thinking about how to develop missionaries to thrive on the field and to be more effective in their ministries. And so I decided, from a long process of narrowing, to focus on the research question that I ended up with, which was, what is the contribution of local Romanian stakeholders to missionary ministry evaluation? And my hunch going into it was that the contribution probably wasn't as much as it ought to be, but I wanted to look at what forms it was taking. And so what exactly is happening in evaluation, because of my contact with missionaries, not just in Romania, but in other places as well. I suspected some things. I knew my own long history of experience with evaluation. And so I wanted to describe it more scientifically, highlight factors that either help or hurt local involvement in evaluation, and also say what is the actual contribution and what could be a greater contribution that local people make in helping missionaries evaluate themselves and maybe helping organizations. And what could I propose as ways to strengthen that kind of collaboration? So I did learn a lot from this research, but I had a lot of decisions to make to get there. And what I decided to do was a mixed method, qualitatively driven design. I knew I needed to go qualitative because in looking at the literature, I could see that there was a lot on evaluation from the interdisciplinary standpoint, but very little when it came to missionary or even ministry evaluation in general. Because there was such a gap in the literature, it would have been foolhardy to try to do anything that was quantitative without some rich data that would help know what kind of questions even to ask. So I started out with a survey because there were some questions that I could answer with the survey, but I wanted to keep this as a support to the interview portion of the research because it needed to be qualitatively driven. So the survey asked about, is evaluation needed? Do you even think that we ought to evaluate missionaries at all? How do you describe effectiveness? What's an effective missionary look like? How do you define evaluation? And what kind of criteria should be used for evaluating missionary ministry? Those were the kinds of questions that I decided I could answer fairly effectively with some questions that were open and got a fair amount of qualitative data for me. Then the rest of the research was semi-structured interviews that would explore the context of evaluation, how people came to be on the field, what kind of ministry they were working in, and then the processes that were being used and how they experienced those processes. What kind of significance did they have? And there were a whole range of answers that I got on all of those kinds of questions. Document analysis I used to triangulate the responses that I was getting from people about organizational practices and values. This was really not a major part of the research, but it is instructive to be able to triangulate. And so what I did was I looked at, for example, evaluation forms that people had to fill out monthly or yearly to say, where are local people in those processes? And that part confirmed to me, if there's no place on the form to say, where is your local partner, ask for input, then obviously it's not a high organizational value that you are getting input from local people to evaluate your ministry. So those were the methods that I chose to use for my research. And so then I had to come to some sampling questions and ask myself, okay, how do I need to go about this in order to get the the right people and enough people to participate in my research. I did choose early on to restrict my setting to Romania, and for a few reasons. One is, if you start to go broad, I could find a lot more missionaries to survey, but then trying to communicate with other stakeholder groups, because I did include everybody who gets involved in evaluation processes in some way, or ought to be local partners, supervisors on the field, like regional leaders or field leaders, home administrators, the people who are in the home office, maybe human resource personnel, or the people who are making decisions at a higher level in the organization, and then sponsoring or sending churches, some of which have a very strong involvement in the life of missionaries, some that have a weaker involvement. All they do is send money and read some prayer letters. I tried to include all those stakeholder groups in my research, but that meant I had to think about how can I manage the sampling so that it isn't too unwieldy and I also get some good information. So I decided to restrict it to Romania because that was the context that I was in. And especially when it came to talking to local people, it meant that I could do it in Romanian. To me, that was a very important aspect. I didn't want to just go through English to try to get the information that I was looking for. I wanted to be able to speak to people in the language that communicated the best with them. So I did restrict it to Romania, but then how many missionaries are in Romania? That would have set me up for the sampling frame for knowing how many people am I talking about when it comes to choosing a random sample. And I found nobody is counting anymore. The last, I think it was 2004 was the last time that any organization had tried to actually survey how many missionaries were in the country. And that was OC International. So I talked to the person in the country at the time who was still doing some research with OC International. He said, well, we're not really collecting data on how many missionaries are here, but his estimate was that it was a lower number than when my husband had done his research, and that it was probably 200, 250 missionaries throughout the country that were there for longer than a very short time. But starting with that number, I still wasn't sure how many of them I would be able to contact. When it comes to the other stakeholder groups, well, then how do you start deciding how many agencies to include, how many home churches to include, and especially how many partners to include, and how do you define and then work through the various contexts that I had, excuse me, to get every name that I could, and then use those contexts to get to the other stakeholders as well as the ones that I knew. So even though I knew that doing this, I did not have in any sense a random sample, I felt comfortable taking this approach because I was focusing on qualitative kinds of information, not quantitative, and so that trying to do statistical analysis was not a high value for me. At the same time, I wanted to say I've talked to enough people to feel confident that what I'm saying is not really outside the range of the normal experience, and that what I am communicating in my research reflects broad missionary experience, as well as the experience of the other stakeholders in the group. So when it came to the interviews, that was actually the sampling that I did for the surveys, try to find every missionary that I can, and then work through them to find the other stakeholders. So when I did this meant that the survey was not launched all at once and done in a short period of time. I had different survey questions for the different stakeholder groups in some ways, or I take that back, on the interviews I did, not on the survey. But what I did was I sent the survey to missionaries, and then I said, okay, now can you give me the names of supervisors, regional leaders, and people that you are working with in Romania, and then sent the survey to those that those names that I received, as well as some other people that I had in mind. When it came to the interviews, this was a different logic. I wasn't trying to go as broad as I could. I was using primarily grounded theory as my basic qualitative approach without neglecting some of the strengths of other qualitative kinds of approaches. So I wanted to do theoretical sampling, that is, selecting the participants in the interviews based on their relevance. And that meant I did need to include every stakeholder group, but focusing on those who find evaluation to be the most pertinent. That meant missionaries who have the broadest experience of it and also the most to say about how it affects them, as well as local people to say, okay, how might you be involved? How are you being involved? What's your attitude toward evaluation? So I did need a smaller sample size to make it manageable, but also I wanted to include every stakeholder group. So I did start with my personal network, especially in the pilot phase when I was still feeling my way into my focused topic. I started with my personal network and focused on people who were well integrated and long-term on the field, most of them, and local people that I knew had fairly extensive contact with missionaries, more than one. And then when I got farther along in the interview process, I did use some that were drawn from survey responses, where I looked at what they had written on their survey and said, this looks like it would be a good person. This person would be a good person for me to talk to based on some of their responses, because I was looking not just for who's like everybody else, but who are the outliers likely to be. I want somebody who maybe doesn't think that they really need to work with local people as much, or has a very high value of evaluation. And then I also looked for some stakeholders, some people who were working together so that I could triangulate between their responses. For example, I had a missionary who invited me to interview their ministry partner in church planting. I also talked to a supervisor from his organization, so that what I could see was I was getting, and other missionaries on the team, and what I could see was I'm getting some different perspectives on what is happening in evaluation. so that one person says, well, I'm sure that the local people are involved, and the other person is telling me, well, no, they're really not. And so that is where some of the interpretation came in terms of the results that I was getting. What's really going on in this relationship, and why are those different perspectives coming in? So when it came to the actual research that I did, here's how my responses came out. I had, for the survey, I had a total of 172 people, 103 North Americans, of which 63 were missionaries, 25 regional or field leaders, 34 partners of some kind, either Romanian or North American, and then church representatives, 34. Here is something that I did that afterwards I went, oops, that made interpreting some of the results a little bit harder. In my mind, church representatives, I was thinking those are the people representing churches in North America who represent sending churches. And partners are people on the field who work with missionaries. I found out that Romanians, some of them said, well, I'm a church representative, and some said I'm a partner. And even a couple of Americans said, well, I'm a partner. And I went, oh, I should have defined my categories a little bit better in the beginning to allow for that, because when it comes for comparing across groups, now I've got some kind of odd sampling going on. So you do have to combine to define your categories well, but also maybe allow for some things to come out where you say, oh, I should have thought a little bit more about this in the beginning, but that's okay. I will work with it as I have it. So I did do a fair amount of comparing between North Americans and Romanians, but I also looked at the various groups and qualitatively tried to compare their experiences in relation to evaluation and how they personally viewed their relationship to it. For the interviews, you see the numbers that are there in parentheses are the ones that I did during the pilot phase while I was still narrowing my topic. And a lot of those just had to deal with views of effectiveness, and then some about what does evaluation look like. I was very pleased with the response rates that I got on the survey. You see the middle column there, an overall response rate of 78%, North Americans 75%, Romanians 83%, that of the ones who received an invitation to do the survey that actually responded and sent it in. I expected the Romanian number to be lower. I really did not know that I had that much trust for them to be involved. And what it communicated to me was, one, I had followed a good process so that they felt free to be involved, and also they were interested in this topic and they had a lot to say about it. And it wasn't all critical of missionaries, but it really was, they were very interested in the topic in order to help missionaries partner well with them. So I did get a lot of rich data, both from the survey and from the interviews, and I had a good number of responses. If I were to go back and do something over, I think I would have liked to do some more interviews. But I really felt like I had enough. And part of this was every one of those interviews I transcribed completely, listened to multiple times and reread multiple times, coded more than once. And that's a lot of work. And at some point you have to say, okay, I really do have enough. And if I do more, I might add a little color, but I really have the meat here of what I need for this topic. And I really felt like I did have that when it came to writing up my conclusions. So now let me turn over to what I've been working on now and describe to you a different kind of experience that I've had with the research project for the Center for Intercultural Training. CIT was established about 25 years ago as the training arm for United World Mission. But once they had run through their initial pool of missionaries, they said, you know, it's not worth it to have trainers sitting around waiting for the next missionaries to come through so that they can train them pre-field. Let's open it up to others as well. And out of that has developed a partnership with 18 organizations who are full partners and use CIT, I think, exclusively for their pre-field training needs, and other 60 that have used this training within the past 5 years. So it's partners steer it, but a lot of other organizations use it. There are also a number of missionaries that come through independently if they're sent just by a local church, some of them without an organization or because they want to do it, or local churches that have sent missionaries that they are sponsoring to get training before they go to the field. CIT's mission is to equip cross-cultural workers with an intercultural and biblical mindset for life and ministry. So I think this is one of the strengths of the training program that we do for missionaries before they go to the field, is that we focus on culture learning and being prepared to do that, being prepared to use the language, but also thinking about what it's like to live out of your identity in Christ, with spiritual formation is a very strong component of the training. The training that we do here consists primarily of a 4-week module that's called the equipping module. It's residential, non-formal instruction using adult learning principles as our foundation. Equipping includes spiritual formation, as I said, culture learning, team relationships, including cross-cultural team, spiritual warfare, and some family, marriage and family kinds of aspects. So we do focus on a fairly broad range of topics, not just culture learning, but that is a very strong component of much of what we do. And then a separate module is second language acquisition, which is not actually, it's not learning the language that you're planning that you expect to need. It's how to go about learning the language. So we focus on the attitudes that you need for language learning, some self-knowledge, as well as just some practical strategies and principles for going about learning a second language and using the tools that you have to take charge of your learning. Many participants take all 6 weeks. Some come in and just do the equipping module. Some just come in and do the second language acquisition module because their organization says, no, we do our own training for the other stuff. Some just come to equipping because they're going to a country where they expect to use English as their primary language. So we do have a wide variety of people coming through. Most are long-term, although how they define long-term can vary. Some of them, that's just 2 years, which in my mind is short-term, but in the missions world, that's defined as long-term. So my role at CIT has been developing over about 10 years or so. I started at CIT helping with the second language acquisition course. Have done it from a distance for about 10 years. My husband was on staff full-time before I was, and he, for 10 years, went back and forth from Romania to be part of the equipping modules for about 10 years. And one of the reasons that we decided to move here full-time was just physically he couldn't keep doing that. And it was clear that God was nudging us this direction. So we moved back in December 2018, and I have been integrating in as a training facilitator, mostly in second language acquisition, but now starting also to work with the equipping course as well. This project that I have been working on I'm trying to remember when the design of the project started, at least 2 years before I got involved, that they said, you know, we really want to do an impact evaluation of how missionaries are actually using the training and whether it's making a difference to them.
Pam, can I stop you for a moment? How much more time do you need, as we would also like to get in conversation and questions with you?
The project, oh, I see my connection's unstable. Can you all hear me?
We can hear you. Can I ask you a question?
Yes, please do.
How much time do you need to complete? Because I think everyone would like, after your presentation, to raise some questions.
Okay. Yes, I can see my time is going. Let me try to wrap this up in about 5 to 7 minutes, all right?
Okay.
And then if there's something that I didn't clarify, I can do it then.
Yes.
Yeah. This project I came into actually kind of in the middle of it, where others had been working on designing it. And so this is one of the unfortunate parts. I felt like there were some things about the design that I didn't like, but I didn't really feel the freedom to go ahead and tinker with it too much when people who were much higher up in the organization than I were had been putting it together. So I was asked to take it over and do it because nobody had the time and they thought I could do it, but it did kind of limp along for a while. So the areas that we tried to evaluate with a survey were the basic areas of the training: culture learning, language acquisition, team functioning and interpersonal relationships, resolving conflict, family relationships, personal and professional life, both self-care and development and spiritual life, because these were the areas that we focused on in training. And it was both, how are you doing? And then in some areas like culture and language acquisition, how are you developing? Are you growing in those areas, or have you kind of stagnated? We decided to limit the sample to those from 2013 through 2018, because before 2013, the program was significantly different. There had been some significant changes made to the program, including shortening it. So one issue that we had, even though this was a really clear sample, we weren't sure how many of those we could actually contact, because some of them were not still on the field. That meant their email addresses had changed. We didn't have contact information for everybody. I did get some support from the partner agencies and others to get some of that information. Some were helpful, some really were not. One of the big considerations for the project was security for cross-cultural workers who were in areas where they had to be careful about what they communicated. And that, in a sense, has really hampered a lot of the research, because we made some decisions that meant that some people, I think, weren't sure where the survey came from. I set up an email account that was not related to CIT, but kind of had CIT in the name, so they hopefully would recognize it, but it wasn't related to CIT directly. And we did try to get a control group, but how to get a control group, that was the hard part. Agencies that use CIT didn't all have other non-trained personnel, and then finding people who were not trained proved to be more of an issue than I expected it to be. So we did try to do a census of the alumni from 2013 through 2018. If we had the contact information, tracking some of them down was a good bit of work. We used email as well as Facebook to find some of the people. We asked for control group contacts from the participating organizations. A few of them had them, others did not. They said, no, all our people have been trained somewhere. I tried to snowball from the people who did participate to others on their field, as well as some local people and North American co-workers or supervisors who also said, how is this person doing? To me, it was very important not just to have people telling me how they thought they were doing, but also have some way to confirm that through participants who also know them well. And those people were also contacted through those cross-cultural workers. Unfortunately, if you look at the response rates down the the right column, you'll find that out of 214 participants who had done both equipping and SLA, only 61 responded, 29% response rate. Those who had done equipping only, also 29% response rate. Those who had done only SLA, the second language acquisition course, 24% response rate. You know, in my mind, that's kind of abysmal. It's just very, very low. And then of those people, 28% gave me names for local observers. 46% gave me names for North American co-workers in that first group. And so even though I had better response rates on those groups, 100% of the local observers of the control group, but that was only 4 people. That was just far too low for me to have any usable data. And so even though I've gotten some interesting information, it is not reliable at all. I cannot say with any certainty that the information that I've gotten really shows the impact of our training. And so this survey was launched this year. It was over a shorter time frame than what I did in Romania. But at some point you have to say, I'm not going to be getting more response than this. What lessons have I learned from this one about, well, low response rates? One, all that extra security may have reduced both the ease of access and people's recognition of the project and their willingness to commit to doing it. I think COVID turned out to be a much bigger factor than we expected. Agencies didn't have the time to help. People were stressed. And some of them, I think, thought, what do I have to say right now? I'm not even, how can I talk about how effective I'm being when I'm not even able to do any ministry? I think the topic itself, for people who are not, if they're not feeling that they're doing as well, they may be reluctant to talk about how they're doing it, even on an anonymous survey. And I think a large factor also was that CIT had not made the effort to have regular ongoing contact with alumni other than individual kinds of contacts. And so that's just decreased some motivation to help. And some just simply did not have local co-workers or supervisors that they could refer. So I ended up with insufficient data, and I hate to write up the report because I'm going to have to say, this isn't really as helpful information. We need to do a different kind of project, which I probably will propose. So my conclusions, if you want to do statistical analysis, you have to be really ambitious about the kind of sample that you choose from. If you want, because every subgroup ought to have 50 to 100 in it. At least you aim for 100 and be happy if you get a few less. You can do less if you go qualitative. And so my next evaluation for CIT will aim at being qualitative rather than quantitative. And connections really matter. It might be that your connection is based on an ongoing relationship. If not, by referrals from people that matter to the person that you're trying to get to participate. If people are interested, they will get involved as long as they trust that you are going to handle the research professionally and ethically. And I think disclosure really plays a large part in that. Timing matters. COVID really did, I think, throw a wrench in the works with this. And the final one, it's really hard to predict what kind of response you'll get from research. That's just a variable you can't always control. And so you need to have a plan for what you're going to do with it if you don't get the response that you expect. Sorry, I meant to leave more time for questions. Go ahead and.
Thank you very, very much for this study, and also especially your kind of challenging outcome and lessons learned, because this is so helpful for those who are in the midst of doing their PhD. What do you do? How do you really do the research? Now it is time for questions or clarifications. I don't know if someone wants to start us up. Is there anyone who would like to start? It is an amazing study, very interesting to get more solid results out of that. That would be something. And then, yeah, I found it interesting that you are commenting it's rather better to go with a qualitative study then.
Yeah, if you want to do quantitative, you do need to have enough of a group to do it. And you have to think, do I have enough of a group to start with to do a random sample that is that large? If not, then I just try to do everybody that I can. The problem is when you try to do any kind of comparison within a subgroup of the larger group. And to set up a study like I did in the second one, where I tried to use a control group, well, the control group should have been the same size as my missionary sample, and it was much smaller. Because I was trying to go from missionaries to say, okay, who do you know on the field who doesn't have training? That's the problem, is finding the ones who don't have training. And I got names given back to me that were missionaries that didn't qualify for the control group because they were on the field too long, or because they actually did have some training. So trying to find all that information in advance was hard, but it would have been, it would have taken more legwork, but it would have been worth it to come up with a better research design.
Wow. Other questions or comments? I know some of us are working in this with this methodology and struggle partially. Some are starting to work in it. So yeah, feel free, now is the chance to listen also to someone who has been working through it, learning also by suffering through some of that.
Yeah, I've learned a lot from the CIT research, but unfortunately, a whole lot of it has been about what not to do.
Yeah, so often. Yes. I don't know, Katarina, you are sometimes teaching even this methodology to doctoral students, especially in the ODC. I don't know if you want to comment somewhere in this lines.
Well, I can congratulate Pam that she persisted to the end and had a plan B and C and so on. And I think the most important is that I assume that in the dissertation, you also discuss the problems and the lessons learned. And I think this is absolutely legitimate for all of us, because as you say, it's quite unpredictable and you are dependent on the respondents. You never know in advance what kind of information will they give you, and will this be helpful, and how many will respond. So you did have a good response rate at, for the dissertation writing. That's wonderful. But I think as long as it is reflected, even the poor responses and the research, because a dissertation you basically write for your supervisor. Yes, you want it published, but first of all, first audience is the supervisor, and that person wants to see how balanced, how argued, how thought through your conclusions are.
Yeah, I think time constraints are hard because you do kind of have a timetable for when you want to get your research done. You know, there's a meeting in November. I have to have a report ready for that. That puts a time constraint there. And at the same time, you don't want to rush any phase. You can't rush the design phase and thinking through, what are my questions? How do I need to go about it? Who are the people? And collecting that database of who your sample is and who you're going to talk to. I really didn't have the option of saying, look, I want to spend a year collecting more of a control group. I just had to go with what I had on this study and hope that more names would surface, which unfortunately not enough did. But that would have, timing can.
It appears her internet has froze again.
Yeah.
That's what technology sometimes does.
Oh, I think you're back.
Did I freeze?
Froze for a moment.
Oh. Yeah, I'm in the hills of North Carolina where we have some of the slowest internet in the world, I think.
Oh, goodness. Yeah, that's sometimes nature plays its role as well. Yeah. Well, any other comments, questions? Yes, Taylor, please.
Well, I know our conversation has been focused on the methodology, but I'm very much curious, what were the surprises that came out in the interviews or in the responses you got in terms of evaluating missionaries? Was there anything that surprised you?
I would say for me, the biggest surprise in my dissertation research was I expected to find a whole lot of challenges from having local people involved. And what I found was in that actual process, when it is being done informally, not formally for the most part, missionaries found it encouraging. Instead of finding that local people point out all their mistakes, they found it encouraging. They learned, but they also were encouraged. And I thought, oh, I think maybe we don't do it because we're afraid. We don't always ask, am I doing this right or am I doing the right thing? Because we're afraid of what they might say to us. No, no. And in fact, if we're working with people who love us, they will give us information we need, but it can be an encouragement as well as being empowering to them and kind of equalizer in the relationship. I'm not used to thinking of evaluation as being encouraging. It's something I don't really like. And I think that's probably true for most of us.
And
We know we need it, but that doesn't make it enjoyable. It's like going to the doctor,
Did you find that you were up against any issues of the public transcript versus the hidden transcript? Like, people will say things to be polite and you have to really dig to get below that. I know in my research, I found that because I did recorded interviews and people would start giving the diplomatic answer, and it took a while for them to drop that and start getting honest about their critiques.
This was one advantage. I know you're not supposed to just go to your friends, but I started with going to my friends, and that cut a whole lot of that. And then I went to other people and see, am I getting the same kind of answers? Because you do need a variety. But for some of what I wanted to know, I wanted people who would actually talk to me directly. And so I didn't feel like I was just getting scripted answers. I got either people who were engaged, felt like they were contributing to serious research, and so they wanted to give serious answers, or people who were really giving me heartfelt answers. I would say it was more a problem with the missionaries of feeling like I was getting some of the more scripted kinds of responses. And
very interesting. That's what I've found very interesting, how you described the Romanian against the missionaries. So they were much more serious and much opener to you in some ways.
Being able to talk in Romanian made a huge difference.
Oh, yeah.
That was one reason it was so important to me. They trusted my level of language to mean that I knew something about the culture. So I wasn't just an outsider doing it. I was not a full insider, but at least a partial insider. Well, and being able to say, here's my local connection with the ones who didn't know me really well. Here's the church I am part of. I've been in the country this long. It made a big difference, I think, in what they were able to share. And knowing for me that I'm able to be a bit self-critical as an American made a big difference. In fact, I invited more criticism than they gave me.
Yeah, this is, I think, important to invite, showing that you are welcoming, not just good words, but also some critical comments. Yeah, the setting is so important. and to trust. And as you say, I mean, when people work with different ethnic groups, and some are in this group of participants, then it seems to be very helpful to overcome barriers also by knowing at least some of the language and culture. That makes you a bit of an insider.
Yeah, it did help me to transcribe interviews and then look them over very carefully, and to do that as I went along, not save transcription for later, but do them kind of as I did the interview, do 2 or 3, get them done before I go do the next interview, because I learned from that process what went well. Were we on the same wavelength? There were some times when I went back, when I transcribed and went, oh, they weren't really answering the question that I asked. They were following their train of thought from the previous question. But it wasn't just a language barrier. It was the same kind of thing that happens, I think, with even if you're both in your first language.
Interestingly. Any other comments, questions? This is the last chance before I close this door. Well, I hope that there might be some others who may, I don't know if this is a possibility, to contact you and write maybe to you or chat somehow with you. Because I think some will be moving into this area, others are right there and may need some advice, not just from a supervisor, but from someone who went through this. Yeah. Krista, how are you doing actually in all of that? You must be almost finished, right?
Actually, my deadline is before Christmas, so I'm planning to send my paper and entire draft to my supervisor, who is Anna Marie.
Yes.
So I'm working chapter by chapter. So actually, 3 chapters were almost done by September, but I need to rework them. And actually, I read through Pamela's research and the dissertation, and a big congratulations, because it's very complex and very, 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 I don't know, I could not describe. And I was reading it through because I do also qualitative research. I do interviews, I do surveys, and I planned the surveys for both qualitative and quantitative research, but because of the feedback from people, I just stayed with the qualitative part, because I did not receive so many answers, and it's also difficult to reach out to people. My audience is Christian business leaders in Hungary, so it's not so easy to define the people, where are they, even though I am involved in some organizations. So I am still in the middle, and I am at the analysis part. So now I'm working on analyzing the results I've done with the interviews, and I move into the analysis of the survey. Maybe I will contact you directly, Pamela, because I will have some specific questions on how to evaluate the text-based qualitative data, and how to describe the results nicely in the paper. So that would be my main question. So I will contact you definitely.
Okay.
That was a part of the hope of those kind of conversations here, that out of this, maybe we'll have a continuing conversation, and especially for you, Krista, in this final phase. You have to present your dissertation at the Christmas tree.
Not my present before Christmas, but hopefully I still have some time until February, March to finalize.
Oh, good.
But
Good.
yeah, I want to do my part before Christmas.
I just thought I will soon see and hear more about your results.
Yeah,
We'll wait a bit and look forward to see you at some point at this presentation. yeah, but again, I want to encourage everyone. I know that not everyone wanted to speak openly here, and for some it might be also an issue of language. And again, others are maybe just on YouTube, and so maybe are able otherwise to reconnect. And I think the best way is through Taylor, if there's the question, that this way the communication line would go. Now I want to thank you very, very, very much for sharing all of this, and honestly, and showing also all the difficult points that you have gone through, because this is sometimes this is the best areas to learn. Oh, often it is the best fields where we learn. And again, congratulations, and let us give a
Thank you.
yes. And well, we are going to have another similar meeting in a bit more than a month's time. And I want to encourage all who are listening on YouTube or here through Zoom to connect. And we are happy if you want to just be in. You know, we haven't created anything for those who have been and have graduated, but I think we are really in need to create some kind of a group, not as an additional burden to those who have been at ODC, but as a possibility to connect also, again, like here, between those who are in the middle and those who have recently finished, because this is so much more helpful than like my dissertations from 1997, you know. Well, on this note, I want to wish you have a good afternoon, and I think those three from Central Asia have a good evening, and look forward to see you all hopefully soon again. And Pamela, again, it was so good to see you, and I hope this is not the last one, and blessings as you continue from the distance serving this region. Thank you very, very much for doing this.
Thank you.
Yes. Goodbye then.